We're talking about grief and loss in a multicultural context. And so I had you read a couple of introductory chapters from two particular texts and then also choose a few other chapters at your own discretion, mostly because I wanted to give you a chance to maybe choose populations that you work with, or maybe it's your own social location background that you come from. And the reason I like these particular texts is that the authors of the individual chapters are writing from their own particular ethnic and cultural background. So, in a sense, they're sort of speaking from within. And then the editors are the ones that kind of formulate it, put it together, write some of the introductory chapters, and so on. So, that's what we're going to do this week. Of course, we can't cover every different approach or possible cultural understanding or ethnicity. So, in one sense, I kind of view this week as kind of flying over the surface rather than being as close to the ground, which unfortunately is not as effective. But I think it's helpful to give us some general principles and things, and we can dive deeper where necessary. Because by and large, especially if you are from the West, and particularly this country, we often assume and overlook and take for granted a lot of things that we feel are universal when actually they're particular. They just happen to be particular to the American context. And historically, the American context and or the West were the folks that had access to authorship and printing presses and so on. And so those were the voices that shaped the narratives and understandings. I would say in the last, well, it's sort of been 20 years or so, but really in the last probably 10 years, particularly at the turn of what we would call the postmodern era, there's been a lot more productivity from indigenous voices and other authors who speak from non-Western places, from their own cultural background and understandings. And so I gave you a few quotes from various authors to sort of shape that a little bit. So you see one there from Rosenblatt that you might have read already, basically talking about that, how American social scientists unintentionally sort of infused ethnocentric ways, in a way generalizing for all people in all places, making sort of meta-grand statements and narratives about how things are and should be, when in fact the understanding was very particular. And so it just invites us to be more aware of our own social location, and that we need to, so in the way that I think about it, we need to deconstruct some of our own hidden assumptions and biases, and then reconstruct maybe a more sensitive, particular, contextual understanding of ourselves and in relationships. And then we connect that to grief and loss, and how especially as pastoral caregivers, we just need to be cognizant of that as we're caring for others who inevitably will be different from us in some ways. And so this week, there'll be some questionnaires and inventories that I'm not going to talk through, but I'll post them so you can kind of work through at your leisure. So you see the first one there is called the Multicultural Awareness Quiz. And these, again, are just sort of for your own self-reflective process. You ask yourself these questions. And there'll be a few more later on about some of our common ground economic background and other things like that. So again, take as much time as you need. And really it just comes down to the frame that the term that I use often to frame this is contextuality. A newer term is maybe intersectionality, that talks about the various layers of our identity and how they intersect with one another and make us unique individuals and beings. And then particularly when we look at power dynamics and relationships, there are certain configurations of those layers of identity that are given status and respect and labels of appropriate, and then there are certain constellations of those that are marginalized and silenced and deemed inappropriate, and so on and so forth. So we'll kind of talk through that later on as we look at some of the difficulties that arise in light of contextuality and intersectionality. And so again, you can kind of see some author definitions of those on the next slide. And then I wasn't real skilled in graphic design, but you see the one that talks about sociocultural context. And ideally, this would be concentric circles. And so the smallest circle would be the microsystem, and the next would be the mesosystem, and the exosystem, and the macrosystem. And essentially, it's just reminding us that we are all layered into these systems of our identity and our connections to others. And so when we think about ourself on our identity, we're always a self in connection to and in relationship to these larger systems of interconnection. And we also need to be aware of those larger, concentric circles moving out form our understandings of self. And in a sense, it's as if we all have particular cultural lenses, and we put on our cultural lenses, and that's what we view the world through. That's what we view ourselves through. That's what we view God through, relationships. Our theological interpretations and understandings come out of our particular social location and way of knowing and way of seeing. And so that shouldn't freak you out. It shouldn't. Sometimes people get concerned about, well, that's relativism, and it means that there's no truth and all of that. And honestly, to me, that doesn't mean that there's no truth. It just means that we need to be aware that truth is contextualized, and that we need to be aware of who's making the truth claims, where are they claiming from, what are the power dynamics involved, who gains from those truth claims and who doesn't, etc. So some of that is just background. And that's more of just kind of setting the tone for then when we look at the particularity of grief and loss. So one author, Mary Catherine Bateson, summarized this concisely, saying, what would it be like to not only have color vision, but also culture vision, the ability to see the multiple worlds of others? So hopefully, if nothing else, what we're doing this week is helping each of us gain some clarity in our cultural vision, our understanding and ability to see others in their particular multi-layered cultural context, and how that shapes them and how that shapes our understandings of them, and our own cultural location and how that shapes us. So now we get to the point where there's a slide that says defining culture. And there's been different ways that folks have defined culture. One that I like comes from a pastoral theologian, Emmanuel Lartey, who is originally from Ghana, and then he studied in the UK and now teaches at Emory University in Atlanta. And I've just appreciated the way that he approaches understandings of culture, but also theologically, and particularly pastoral theologically. And you see his quote there, and the summary, the way that I appreciate what he's getting at is the phrase that I underlined there, the particular and distinctive way of life. So essentially, when we talk about culture, we're talking about the way that we come to understand life and what it means and how we live. And so often I will talk about capital C culture, and those are sort of the big categories that we tend to think of: race, ethnicity, maybe what part of the world you're from, and so on and so forth. But there's also smaller C culture, where we may be the same race, ethnicity, gender as someone else, and yet our culture is different from theirs because we grew up in a rural environment and they grew up in an urban environment, or we grew up in this part of the United States and they grew up in that part of the United States. And there's very different regional understandings and dialects and ways of knowing. So anyway, that's a particular and distinctive way of life. And then you see some primary features of a culture, a history, a dominant organized sense of religion, belief, and so on. And then you see some secondary features. All of that, again, is backdrop to invite you to think about your own self-definition. So how do you think about yourself? And later we'll look at your culture of grief and loss and so on. But before we get there, how do you identify yourself? If you're introducing yourself for the first time to someone and you sort of need to identify different aspects of yourself, for me, I often do so depending on the particular context. So what context am I in right now? And so those are the ones that seem to rise to the surface, but those aren't the only layers of my identity. So when I introduced myself in this course, I talk more about my academic history and credentials and my pastoral ministry and so on, and that sort of thing. But if I was in a different context, maybe I would discuss some other layers of identity that are still there and still valuable. So anyway, again, I just invite you to think about your own way of identifying yourself, and then how do you think that shapes your experience of grief and grieving? And again, press pause there because we will come back to that. But I wanted to sort of get your mind working as we're going there. So then on the next few slides, it's the series of inventories that I mentioned earlier. So there's statements about common ground activity. Does this statement apply to you? Class background inventory, privilege questionnaire inventory. Again, you can kind of take your time working through them. They come from a particular text about teaching and social justice, which helps us kind of unmask and identify some of these aspects. So feel free to take as much time to, as I've mentioned earlier, pause the video and write things down if you need to, come back to it, that sort of thing. And then when you're ready, kind of jump to death and culture. And so that's where we'll pick it up now. So I just want to invite you to take a few minutes and quickly write down all of the words that come to mind when you hear the word death. So again, sort of free form, what things flow into your mind, etc. You don't have to filter yourself. There's not a should or shouldn't or a right or wrong. You just write these down. And you can take a minute or two. And when you're ready, then you sort of go into the next phase of look over your list now and put a plus mark or a negative mark or an N for neutral next to each word and note, is it generally positive? Is it generally negative? Is it generally neutral? And then once you've done that, then step back and kind of add up your positive statements, negative statements, neutral statements, and see what the result is. Does that surprise you? Does it not surprise you? Maybe you thought, wow, I didn't have any idea I was so negative towards death. Or I couldn't even come up with any words because I try to avoid thinking about death at all costs, or so on. Again, another way for you to self-reflect and more invitational. Take as much time as you need. The next slide is a death awareness questionnaire. So again, kind of read through all of the bullet statements there and ask yourself these questions. Jot down things that stand out to you. These are things maybe you could discuss in the forum. So in addition to the readings, you might say, as I was working through the questionnaires, these are the things that really got me thinking or really have me wrestling with this particular issue or concept or so on and so forth. On the next slide there is one called My First Experience and History with Death. And so you can think about your very first experience with death of a family member, a pet, a friend, some other person that was close to you and how that impacted you. And then you can kind of work through and answer the questions. How old were you? What or who died? How did you feel? How did you act? How was everyone else? How did they act, etc. And if you really want to, you could create a timeline, sort of graphically, of these are the sort of crucial moments of death in my life. And this is, as I step back and look at it, this is sort of the story of death in my life that I see, and common themes, or maybe common characters, or maybe plot twists, those sorts of things. So again, that's the first experience in history with death. The next one is the loss awareness list. So we've talked, and if you read the Mitchell and Anderson text, you saw a pretty good discussion about the various forms of losses. I think the one that maybe I touched on briefly was ambiguous loss, which we could add in as another category. But take a few minutes and kind of note in your life the different losses that you've experienced. And there's some examples listed there. And again, as you're reflecting, start to note, are there common themes? Are there things that really jump out and surprise you? Are there things that maybe somehow were out of your awareness or consciousness, and all of a sudden they're bubbling up and you're unfamiliar with, you're not sure what to do with them? And sometimes when we do that, we bring up strong emotions, and we realize maybe I haven't processed through this effectively yet, or we have, and will continue to do so, and it will be one that we carry with us, and we'll always have strong emotional attachments with it, and that's okay as well. The next one of these questionnaires is the last one that we'll do with part one of this week's lecture, and then I'll stop this video and create a new one for part two. But this is the grief awareness scale. So again, there's a series of statements. and or questions. So kind of work through following the death of a loved one. How long would you expect the survivors to grieve, et cetera, et cetera. And just kind of respond how you would in these particular situations. Again, noting common themes or things that stand out to you and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the end of the first part, which I went through quickly, but hopefully you got the idea that we're just kind of looking at ourselves and how our own understandings of grief and loss have been contextual and sort of culturally embedded and culturally mediated and have shaped our understandings.